Thank you, MASTS, for the opportunity to present our science on participatory mapping for natural capital. Hello, everybody around Scotland. It's always a bit weird talking in this format to a camera in a room by myself, but I know there are lots of you out there, so thank you very much for coming on board. I hope everyone is well and your families are well and everybody is looking after themselves in these tough times. So I just want to kick off with some of the background to this work. The talk's going to talk about natural capital. I'm going to very fly through some of the concepts because we've heard a lot about this, and then talk about some of the applications that I've been developing. Predominantly my colleague, Dr. Daryl Burdon, as well, of Daryl Burdon Limited, as well, who's jointly developed a lot of this work together on participatory mapping and natural capital. Okay, so very quickly, just to go through some of the concepts there. These terms are being used quite a lot in the discourse around the governance and the management of our coastal and marine regions and our terrestrial regions. And natural capital, many definitions abounding around that. It's the elements of nature that directly or indirectly produce value to people. So these are physical components of nature. Ecosystem services flow from natural capital. So these are the functions and the products from nature that can be turned into benefits with different degrees of human input, with different forms of capital, knowledge capital, financial capital, infrastructure. We convert natural capital and services into things that are useful for us as people. And then benefits are the changes in welfare that result from the consumption of goods, or from the knowledge that something exists. For example, many of the cultural services that are a key part of the ecosystem services approach. And there are some sort of simple ways to reflect this. We have a stock of natural capital. This can be the habitats, the water column, the species that are within that. That natural capital stock produces flows, and then those flows, when we include things such as capital, so if we want to get our national dish of fish and chips, then we need built human and social capital. We need fishing boats. We need fishermen to go out and catch that. We need knowledge. We need money and resources to turn what is essentially a final ecosystem service of a cod or a haddock into the thing called fish and chips, which we love to eat. And this, of course, works a whole variety of different ways. We have, again, the stock. The flows from the stock could be puffins, for example, wildlife, which then drives huge interest across the UK and globally around recreation and sense of place and tourism industries and knowledge and understanding. And to do that, again, we need boats, we need knowledge, we need experts and guides to convert essentially that component of the system to a benefit which is useful, in this case, our well-being, our sense of place. And so many of these ideas around ecosystem services, not so much natural capital, but particularly around ecosystem services, were formulated in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. There was a huge amount of work which happened in the UK NEA and the NEA follow-on across all, actually, biomes and ecosystems, not just the coastal and the marine environment. And this idea of systems of flows from natural capital. So we have the services, we have the final services and the goods, and from those goods then we can begin to try and unpack and understand what are some of the key aspects of well-being. And we know that well-being is a multifaceted and a complicated issue. It can be measured in economic terms, in health terms, in shared social terms. There are different ways of measuring and understanding value. But we really are standing on the back of a lot of work that has been done in terms of understanding how ecosystems, coastal systems including that, contribute to our societal well-being. And this has led to an increasing understanding within policy, and not only within government, but in the private sector as well, about the importance of trying to understand and incorporate natural capital and ES into our decision making. So, for example, at the UK level, predominantly in terms of the English national jurisdiction, the Defra and the government's 25-year environmental plan really recognises the understanding there to incorporate the full value of the marine environment, incorporate that. This is the key of the natural capital approach. And you can see the various statements here that have come out of that plan. And in some of the work that we have been doing recently in terms of the participatory mapping approach and how we can try and get that into policy as a methodology to deliver one aspect of natural capital, we did a quick mapping of what are some of the policy drivers. And this work will be released, I believe, in about a week's time. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. But if you have a look down this slide there, we have various policy drivers at a UK, England and Scotland scale. We did this for every jurisdiction nation within the UK, but this is just snapshotting the UK and the Scottish levels. There are a range of policy drivers here that are saying natural capital is important. We want to use this as a way of improving decision making and understanding the social and ecological linkages within the marine environment. This ranges from the 25-year plan, the Marine and Coastal Access Act. Really interesting, the Treasury Green Book actually is really pushing a natural capital approach into policy appraisal and policy evaluation and supporting policy goals. And has actually released some really interesting guidance there about how to enable a natural capital approach as in January 2020. And at the Scottish context, we have the Marine Acts, which really states at quite a high level in the Marine Plan that we should be taking an ecosystem services approach, and that we should be aiming for continued delivery of ecosystem services and how the impacts of decision making affects ecosystem services. Some new areas of development in the UK, the Environment Bill and the Fisheries Bill, both have references to natural capital concepts in their draft bills. So whether this is through applying natural capital to net gain or nature recovery networks, reorientation of MPAs towards more natural capital approaches, or through more operational means. I haven't listed the farming bill here, but there are really strong implications there for restoration of terrestrial systems by farmers, which essentially is an ecosystem services approach. And so that could potentially flow on to new requirements for fisheries or fishing communities to restore local systems. So there are a whole range of different policy drivers here. There's some really interesting things happening in Wales with the Future Wellbeing of Generations Act. There are some really interesting levers here where natural capital and ES can be applied. The issue is that we really don't have, at this point in time, a set of practical tools to operationalize this in the planning and the decision-making context. But importantly, the message is here that we do have the levers to do this. And if I can talk about very quickly the Marine Scotland Act, then within the Act, there are various duties to consider social, environmental and economic aspects of marine systems, and potential levers there to include this into marine planning or into MPA designation, for example, research and demonstration MPAs. So today I want to really talk about two approaches that we have developed over time, really over the past 5 to 6 years. The first one is what we call the matrix approach, and the second approach is called the participatory mapping method. The matrix approach is really a method that's pitching at a broader UK level, fitting into sort of the asset register type work and understanding the contributions of particular species and habitats and trying to quantify that. And the participatory mapping method really works at the local scale of working with communities in co-production around understanding natural capital ecosystem services and how they're distributed locally and what that means for communities. So if I step back here again, we saw that picture from the National Ecosystem Assessment. Well, through some work we did in the Valuing Nature Network, we developed a marine-orientated model for ecosystem services. I won't labour this point too much. It was published in the publication there you see on the bottom right-hand side. But this idea of that we are moving from a stock, which is the natural capital, that we see up here. That stock then produces flows of ecosystem services, intermediate and final services, expressions of the system that we can use, and then by this built capital, input of social and human capital, we produce a variety of benefits that are consumed both in material and in non-material ways for coastal communities and communities around the UK, not necessarily just coastal communities. We took this model and we converted it and developed it into a quantitative matrix to try and understand actually what are the services and benefits from specific habitats and species. So I'm not going to go through every square here, just to show you what this looks like. This is work from essentially from 2014 that we've developed over the years. So what we have here are the different features. So down this column here are different features protected under both UK devolved and European legislation there. We have intermediate services. So these services correspond with the services here on this diagram. We have the goods and benefits produced as well. Then we have an assessment of the importance. So every species, every habitat, we made an assessment that was peer reviewed, consulted widely using an expert-based approach to whether those habitats and species provided a significant, moderate, or low or no contribution. We also made an assessment of confidence in terms of the information behind that relationship. So was it expert based, or was it obvious? Was it grey or overseas literature, or was it UK related or peer reviewed literature? And we also did this across a range of different feature types, so Scottish MPAs, English MCZs, Welsh MCZs, for example, and European sites as well. Now, you're not meant to be able to see this or look at any detail on it. It's just simply to show you that we made a whole range of assessments. The left-hand matrix is for habitats. The right-hand matrix is for species. So we had 30 habitats protected by EU legislation. We had 10 species protected by EU legislation, highly mobile species, and 42 species by not so new now MPA legislation. So it gives you what you can see here. It gives you a very broad idea of how those habitats and how those species then produce a range of ecosystem services and benefits. And some very broad brush things you can see here is that we have a lot more information and confidence about what habitats are doing on the left-hand side. There's a lot more black and grey squares there on the left-hand side, as opposed to individual species. We have a lot less information there about those. Also, habitats tend to provide a lot of multifunctional benefits there across a whole range of different both services and benefits there. But what this does at a UK scale, these scores are relative to each other. They're not produced in isolation, so we compare and contrast the scores across habitats. It gives us a basic quantitative understanding of the contribution of those habitats and species to a particular set of services or benefits. I'll just skip through that. We also realized that there was a gap in this work, and in 2017 we produced a paper, Daryl Burdon and myself, Carol Barbone and Lucas Mander, produced a paper on plugging in seabirds into this. We realized that we hadn't incorporated marine seabirds into this and understanding the services and the benefits that they provide. So we produced some work looking at that, again trying to get a baseline understanding of how individual species, quite challenging, contribute to a range of services and benefits. And realizing that these types of approaches aren't particularly visual and particularly difficult to use, particularly when we're working with stakeholders, we developed with Steve Barnard and the matrix work that we've done a way of visualizing these using these windrows type plots, where you can simply select an individual habitat or species and then look at the level of service or benefit that is provided from it. So we have intermediate services from coastal salt marshes here on the left-hand side, and we have benefits coastal salt marshes on the right-hand side, where the outer circle is high importance and the inner circle is low or no importance. So it gives you, again, a much more visual way of trying to understand, well, what are the benefits from coastal salt marshes? So we can see there are very strong benefits in terms of some of the regulatory ecosystem services and waste breakdown, carbon sequestration, supporting services like primary production. On the benefits side, we have to see there are strong aesthetic benefits, tourism and nature watching benefits in terms of cultural services, and benefits from regulatory services such as waste burial and removal, things like that. So it gives a nice visual snapshot of what we're doing. I'll skip through that. So that leaves us with, we discovered what we found was a significant problem, was that on one hand, we have a growing body of knowledge, not just the work that we've done, but also some of the other more broader ideas around asset registers and conditions of ecosystem services at the national scale or at the Scottish scale. On the left-hand side, these big picture ideas, big large databases of the conditions of services. But we felt there was a major gap here of actually, well, what happens in a community? Because from the community perspective or the stakeholder perspective, that many ecosystem services are used and consumed at a local scale or a regional scale. And we felt that there was that communities have a real role to play in this, and that's certainly recognised in some of the formulations of the recent environmental strategies by the Scottish Government, where some of the knowledge accounts noted that there was a specific evidence gap around how do we actually engage communities in this quite vague concept to them of natural capital, and how do we raise awareness of them, how do we engage them in this process, and importantly, how can we actually make decisions and steer investment towards communities improving their natural capital at a local scale. So some of the questions, I've just reiterated them there. Some of the questions we were looking at in this work are how actually a service is identified at the local scale. Who benefits from services? Who receives the benefits? Benefits from natural capital aren't distributed evenly. There are actually many interesting factors to consider there, whether it's social demographics or political aspects of who actually gets the benefits and how are they used. How are benefits traded off in scenarios or decisions, and how do they support well-being, are all really enduring questions we have about making natural capital actually relevant concept for marine and coastal and marine communities. And we have developed a series of pilots over the past 5 years in Wick, Aberdeen, in the Wash and the Humber Estuary in England. And we had developed a process to develop participatory mapping as a technique to try and understand how these services are distributed at local levels. What are the activities, what are the features, how we map those out, and what type of benefits they produce. And I'm not going to talk about those four cases today. That's really the way we've developed the methodology, and we've written all this up into a paper that was published last year. It feels like yesterday, published last year, which actually goes through the mapping methodology. What I wanted to focus on today in the brief time that I have is actually one of the most recent applications of this work, and that is we were brought on board as a part of the Defra and MMO Marine Pioneer program in England. And we applied our work to a place that I'd never been to before, the Deben estuary in Suffolk. And the Marine Pioneer program is really looking at how natural capital ideas can be applied to both community scale and government scale policy making and protection of the marine environment, how they can be operationalized and used to improve decision making. So we were brought in to do this. We had 3 aims and 3 workshops that we ran. We wanted to look at the role of participatory mapping and deliberation for natural capital and enhancement of natural capital in the Deben estuary. We want to look at trade-offs between different elements of ecosystem services and benefits in the Deben estuary. And we want to look at actually the beneficiaries of ecosystem services and benefits in the Deben estuary and how that rolled out. And this is really about how we test these ideas in a live community setting, how we develop the data and how that data is used. And probably most critically, does this actually support communities in understanding and working with the concepts of natural capital? So this is kind of a big one to take on board, but we have developed essentially a 10-stage process that we ran this over 3 workshops. You could add more or less to that, but we found we needed 3 workshops to do this in the community setting. So this ranges from sort of front-end engagement with communities, and working very closely with the coastal partnerships and nature partnerships. We found that was a really good inroad to actually unlocking some of the community expertise and community interests around their coastal systems. We looked at then co-production of the workshops, getting community members in the workshop design at an early stage. We looked at mapping and identifying of features, mapping benefits, producing a range of GIS outputs and materials for communities and decision makers to use, and then development of scenarios, and then a range of stakeholder-based tools and visualization tools and feedback. So I'm just going to cherry pick some of the steps of this process we went through, and this process is what we have written up for the MMO and Defra in a methodological guidance document that will be published in about a week's time, and supported by a 2-page summary, policy summary as well, that will be open for everyone to see. Excuse me. So what did we do? So one of the first inroads here of making this work in the first workshop was to use satellite imagery, and we had tested different approaches in the previous 4 pilots around using, say, outputs from the national marine databases and the marine atlases, but we settled on using satellite imagery because it gave us a really nice granular view of the Deben estuary. So what we did was we downloaded the relevant images. We split the Deben into an upper, middle, and a lower section. And then in the workshops, different tables worked on different sections of the Deben. Then we went through and started discussing and identifying and mapping the features. So these include the natural features, so reed beds, for example, mudflats, for example, but also some of the human features as well. So boundaries or cable sites, for example, were noted, or archaeological sites. So a whole range of what could actually stakeholders pick up from the satellite imagery and discuss. And this starts to build this knowledge of what is in the region, what is there, how do we identify it, what's the extent of it, for example, what condition is it in. And then you can see probably from those maps there's a whole lot of handwritten codes and signs. We looked at classifying these different features according to a key. And then the next exercise we did in the workshop 1 was to map the benefits. So what are the different types of benefits that you get from the Deben estuary? We did this first by just noting the benefits down on post-it notes. or on whiteboards, and having group discussions about the types of benefits that you get from the estuary. And then we went back and then tried to spatially allocate those benefits to particular features in the system. And so some of the things that we could produce from doing this work out of workshop 1 was, and there's a link there in the bottom to the work as well, we could understand, for example, some of the spatial aspects of features. So we could see that the system that we looked at was heavily dominated by pasture land, arable land, but it gives us some initial numbers to work with about the extent of those features. We could also then begin to look at what the benefits are from the system. So the 3 different working groups within the workshop identified about between 20 and 40 benefits per table. We clustered and classified those different benefits there, everything from traditional ecosystem services, regulatory services like nutrient cycling and habitat formation, food provisioning services, through to things such as cultural services like sense of place, education and research, health benefits, and some we couldn't classify, for example, like sand supply or energy, I think archaeology and things like that. And then because we actually tried to spatialize these benefits, we then were able to produce an interactive PDF after workshop 1 of the features and the benefits for that particular region. This was a PDF, was a great format. We could send this out very easily to all the stakeholders. The layers you could click on and off. You could see just how the different features are distributed. You could see what benefits are attached to particular features. For example, what does salt marsh or reed beds produce or mudflats produce in terms of the type of benefits. So a really nice, easy tool there for stakeholders to use, and that could go on to help inform in their coastal planning efforts. What we did in workshop 2 was then to really start to turn towards the ideas of scenarios. And how do these features and the benefits they provide change over time? And so working with scenarios is a very challenging thing to do with community scale work. You have to, we discovered this perhaps in a hard way of really having to work closely with stakeholder views in the process, and even selecting the type of scenario can be quite a challenging and controversial process. Not everyone agrees that the scenario is the right one, or that the conditions of the scenario are going to be fulfilled, or that we should even be discussing scenarios at all. So it was quite a steep learning curve for us in learning how to actually co-design scenarios. It's actually a really critical aspect of doing scenario work. But one of the scenarios that we looked at was a change in the feature. So you see here on the top figure that we have a salt marsh dominated system. That's the business as usual scenario. And then from sea level rise, we could anticipate that salt marsh, that's 108 hectares of salt marsh and 57 hectares of mudflats, may switch to become more of a mudflat dominated system. So essentially a switch there from a salt marsh dominated system to a mudflat dominated system. Then we work with stakeholders on, well, how does that change the type of benefits you get from the estuary? So using our visual tool, this is where we brought the matrix work back in to the participatory mapping, because from the matrix work, we had some of that data about the benefits that are provided from key habitats such as salt marsh and habitats such as intertidal mud. We could draw that out of the matrix database using the visualization tools that we developed. On the left-hand side are the intermediate services, and on the right-hand side are the benefits. And then we'd look at how those benefits would change from the salt marsh system to a intertidal mud dominated system. And so you would expect to see various changes across different benefits there. And we discussed these with the stakeholders around the table. Now, we developed another way to visualize this information. So what we did here is this diagram shows generally looking at the mean scores of the changes of those benefits. So some of that data we had through the matrix, we could see how, for example, primary production changed between these systems, or cycling, nutrient cycling. And if the blue bars and the dots represent the mean level of change in the system from the scores. So generally a switching here from a salt marsh system to a mudflat system would result in a general net negative change and drop in different range of services and benefits in that system. Now the dashed lines in that system represent the variance. So because we ask stakeholders to discuss these and score these and understand the variance, then this really shows some of the indecision in these changes, the debates around this. Some were very little. There was generally agreement that there was going to be negative change in this type of service, and some, for example, number 9, wildlife food, there's huge variance in how that will change. And this is really an inexact science that we're dealing with here, of how these benefits can change over a long period of time from some sort of driver, such as sea level rise. But from this picture, we can show that they're generally switching from this type of habitat or feature to another type of feature would result in a general negative change to those benefits. We did this for 2 scenarios. So the other scenario that we used was a change in landscape. So this would be if we move from a system where it was dominated by arable pasture land in the top pie chart here. The beige is arable pasture. And then what would happen then if we actually lost 500 hectares of farmland and through managed realignment, for example, to salt marsh? What will be the change in benefits of that system from moving from farmland, arable farmland, to a salt marsh dominated system? A very controversial scenario with the group we discovered. Again, the same process. So what we found was challenging here was that in the matrix, we didn't have the quantitative assessment of the contribution of arable farmland or pasture land, what services and benefits provided. So we essentially had to work with the stakeholders to score what the different types of confidence and levels of importance of the contribution of that benefit would be. However, for salt marsh, we do have that data and peer-reviewed and published. So that enables us to give us an idea of how, in this scenario, in this particular region, we change from arable pasture land to salt marsh below, and then there is a change in the types of benefits that we get. And we did this visualization. You can see here quite a different one to the previous slide. Now we're seeing more of a net positive change in benefits as we move from arable land to salt marsh. For example, we're seeing much more stronger formation of species habitat. We may see a decline in food production, of course, which would be expected, and a whole range of regulatory services such as coastal erosion, sea defence in particular, tourism, aesthetics. Again, there was a lot of debate around these movements of benefits because there's a lot of subjectivity in the system, which is then reflected by the variance across these scores. So what this does is it gives us a way to understand the benefits and the services and benefits and how they're distributed and mapped in a system, and then using a scenario, then how to understand how those benefits will change when the features change. The third thing we did, which was workshop 3, was to really then go in and try and understand how stakeholders engage and use the system. So in the first workshop, we mapped the features using satellite imagery, and we had discussions. And the whole while we're doing this, the community's knowledge of natural capital, the language they use, their understanding of the concept, the understanding of the different benefits in the system is increasing. We really found that a really interesting output of the work, of the dialogue that we were having with different stakeholders around the table about this. We also mapped the benefits from the system in workshop 1, and we'll refine these in workshop 2. What workshop 3 aimed to do was to identify the different stakeholders and how they use those benefits. We felt this was a real missing link in the work. Now, I'll come back to this slide later on. Let's check the time. What we've done with this work is we've essentially mapped the natural capital on the left-hand side there in workshop 1. We've mapped out the benefits, and so we know how the benefits are spatially distributed that flow from those features. But then what we don't understand, and this is a major gap in the science, I think, is how are those benefits used by different groups? Groups use them in different ways, they rely on them in different ways. And so moving from left to right, we can then get an understanding of the importance of natural capital via the provision of benefits to different beneficiaries in society. And going back the other way, from right to left, we can understand how different beneficiaries are reliant on specific benefits, and then how those benefits then connect back to the natural capital. So we can understand the system go from left to right and to right to left. Its importance of natural capital to society and the reliance of different stakeholders in society on specific parts of that natural capital. So how did we do that? Again, we had some of that information already from our matrix approach in terms of understanding how individual habitats and individual species, with the caveats of that there are lots of major gaps here in the knowledge, how they provide different types of services and different types of benefits. So we had that mapped out already. And what we did was start to develop this concept of a logic chain, this flow of information or resources from the system to different stakeholders, and how can we actually understand the flow of the service through to the stakeholders. So from the matrix, we knew already that we have some data about, say, the benefits of particular types of habitats. So here we've highlighted intertidal mud and salt marsh again. And from the matrix work, we knew, had a relative baseline understanding of whether that was a low contribution of the capital to the benefit, or medium or high. So we had that already, and it enabled us then to understand this flow of the feature to the different types of benefits. So that was the fairly easy part. But what we didn't understand was then, well, we've got these benefits that we've mapped at a local scale. We can see that there are a whole range of complex, spatially overlapping and different types of benefits provided by this estuary, provided by this space. But then how are those actual benefits, how are they used by different members of society? How reliant are different groups of society on these benefits? So what we did was we mapped, we had limited time and resources to do this. So first thing we did was identified a series of key stakeholders for the estuary. It wasn't conclusive. We worked with our local coastal partnerships and the Suffolk partnership as well to identify the key stakeholders. You can see there on the right-hand side, there are a list of stakeholders ranging from the IPBES, environment agencies, a brewery, RSPB, universities, as a segment of testing this way, of testing this idea. And our first thing to do is, well, what do these actually stakeholders do? So, for example, the Environment Agency is equivalent of SEPA in England, and it regulates waste and industry. It manages flood risk. It manages water quality. So a key local beneficiary there. And as a sort of a back of the envelope approach, we scored this within our team or within our group to try and understand then, well, what are they reliant upon? And this was a really interesting debate for us, both internally and in the workshop space, of what do we mean by reliance. And we found that we had to actually take that back and think about, well, what does it mean to be reliant on a particular benefit? And we interpreted it in a few different ways. One way was that, well, the agency, the Environment Agency, is reliant because it manages these different benefits. It's involved in actually improving their quality, for example. It's involved in a regulatory way for delivering something to do with that benefit. That's one way of looking at reliance. Another stakeholder we looked at was, and a big group of stakeholders in the Deben, as with many coastal estuaries, is recreational water users. So sailing, rowing, for example, water sports. What types of benefits are they reliant on? So we had an initial stab at it of making those links. They could be reliant on, for example, formation of seascape. People like to sail in attractive places, on water quality, on obviously on tourism benefits from systems, the physical health benefits from systems, a place to live, biodiversity, a whole range of different benefits that system produces are important to recreational water users. Let's check the time. And then we worked with actually scoring these with stakeholders. So we went through every single one of those beneficiaries with all the stakeholders at the workshops in 3 different groups, and we tried to score, again, like we did with the matrix, a low, moderate, or high reliance upon those benefits. Again, we brought in the visualization aspect, the windrows aspect, and then to say, well, how is this particular organisation, here we have the Environment Agency and IFCA, how reliant are they upon these different benefits? And we're just visualising these relationships, essentially. So, for example, the Environment Agency is highly reliant on the regulatory functions of estuarine systems, particularly through providing nutrient cycling and managing nutrient cycling, water quality issues and flooding issues, which have been very large in the news recently. And then we did this through a whole range of links between capital, benefits and beneficiaries, and that really starts to paint the picture of how does natural capital influence the benefits, and then how those benefits influence the beneficiaries. And so you can start to see these quite complex linkages forming between the different elements of the system, but it builds up a really strong idea of how the natural capital provides benefits, and then how are those benefits used, and how reliant are those different stakeholders upon those benefits. So the importance in one direction, and then the reliance going back in the other direction. Now, just to end off, there's certainly a lot of information here to digest, and I appreciate that. What we did a couple of weeks ago was actually put all this in front of a range of UK and devolved policymakers. We ran a one-day workshop on this. We presented the methodology, we went through it in quite a lot of detail, and we really had a no-holds-barred opening up of the methodology, particularly on how can we actually use this in a policy-making context? Where can it apply? How can we pragmatically use it? And what different regulatory and legislative levers are available for us to do it? And so we developed a SWOT analysis there of this approach. The full report, as mentioned, will be out in a few weeks' time. The methodological guidance, the SWOT report, and the 2-page policy summary will be out for everyone to see there. But some of the strengths that were noticed by the policymakers, where it's really good for empowering local stakeholders. It includes full ranges of benefits, not just those benefits that are economically valuable, but those that are socially and culturally valuable. It captures local knowledge. It really builds upon this place-based approach. Some of the weaknesses are about scalability, and how do we take this up and scale this to a regional or a national scale. Stakeholder fatigue, lots of workshops. How do we do this in a COVID-19 context, for example, where we can't actually go out and meet people? Some of the opportunities there. It could support designation of the highly protected MPAs. It could support marine planning. It's great. It potentially has applications for the offshore environment. It really plugs in to this policy direction of place-based approaches. We're seeing a very strong steer towards place-based approaches in marine planning and governance. And threats, a lack of underpinning data, which is always an issue, resources, costs and time. How do we join this up between land and sea, for example, and how actually do we get communities engaged and empowered in this process, and does that actually work to change anything? So just to conclude, there's a lot there. Appreciate that, and thank you for coming on board and having a look. There is a high-level agenda here about natural capital across the UK. It's clear. And the key is, how do we link this agenda to actually specific policy instruments, planning, licensing, conservation, for example. This approach, participatory mapping approach, addresses the need for place-based and stakeholder-driven approaches to natural capital. We think this is a real gap in getting communities engaged and empowered to understand and make decisions around their natural capital, and to bring inward investment in to manage it and to improve it, particularly with the net gain agenda going from strength to strength. This approach delivers spatial and quantitative information about how benefits are mapped and identified and distributed amongst communities and stakeholders, and it provides a novel means of linking natural and social systems, the core, the essence of an ecosystem approach. And then I think further work will continue to expand place-based approaches that link coastal marine systems to community well-being, for example, particularly now, the substantial agenda behind that, and to support ongoing employment, investment, and sustainable communities at the end of the day. The talk will be online, so you can come back to this. We have produced at this point 3 publications based on the work from the Matrix work in 2014, the birds aspect, the participatory approach we published last year. If you want to have a look at any of the results of the workshops and the processes and debates in the workshops, you can go to the Suffolk Coast and Heaths website to get the project reports. And in a week or so, we will see the formal policy support document coming out. Okay, I'm sick of talking. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm assuming that I'm not talking to myself, that there are people out there. I hope you've enjoyed that. It's particularly difficult seeing beautiful pictures of beaches and sunny beaches at this time where we do have to stay home. But I do hope you get to go out and enjoy some ecosystem services quite soon when all this is done and dusted. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope that was enjoyable. Goodbye from Tavis.
Great, Tavis. That was a really great talk, and you crammed a lot in. Well done. We've received a couple of questions through the Q&A box at the bottom, so if anyone else has any other questions that they'd like to submit, please pop your questions in there.
Well, I just accidentally deleted a question there from Clive Fox, but sorry, I didn't do that deliberately. I'll still have my press stands to live, so I'll answer that one first. Yes, this is a very anthropocentric approach. I agree with you there, and absolutely this doesn't shy away from the fact that ecosystems have an implicit right to be protected. What it aims to do is just really show the tight links that society has with natural systems, and that we as individuals and communities and industries need to understand these links better, that healthy functioning marine systems are absolutely vital for our health, our economy, and our existence. So I think this approach doesn't replace, say, implicit protection of species and habitats, but what it tries to do is to show that we have this really strong link with nature, and that link is essential to our social and our economic well-being, and then to try and incorporate that very difficult area into a decision-making context or a policy system. We're not there yet, but I think this is what it tries to do. It has to work hand in hand with implicit protection of nature, whatever that looks like, whether it's NPAs or other forms.
Okay. Next question was, why do communities need to understand natural capital? What if they have other ways of understanding and valuing these spaces, i.e. what will be closing down / prioritising natural capital?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. Why do they need to understand natural capital? I think communities actually, working with them, communities actually already understand the concepts. They might not call it natural capital, but communities do have an implicit understanding already of some of the benefits from coastal, marine, and terrestrial systems. Now, I think using the natural capital language, or the ecosystem services language, enables us to have a more robust discussion with communities about what benefits that nature provides. It enables us to then, the next step for this kind of work is to say, well, You obviously are getting benefits, different types of benefits from nature. How can we improve this? How can we restore this? It also enables then a platform to then make more explicit trade-offs, say when a development comes along. How does that development or policy actually change these relationships? And so we can have a much more deeper understanding and sophisticated understanding of how these benefits change with different scenarios. So I'm really conscious of not ramming natural capital concepts down the throats of communities, but I think there is a really important discussion to be had about how we actually improve the quality of natural systems, how we understand those benefits, and one key thing is actually how those benefits are distributed, because different groups in society do have access to different benefits and different services, and how we can ensure that there is an equitable distribution of ecosystem service benefits amongst communities, and how we reach those who are not using them and not accessing those benefits. So using the natural capital language actually unlocks a lot of those discussions, and it shows how we are connected to those systems. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah, and the next question was, how do you recognise and take into account implicit interactions and trade-offs when analysing changes in systems?
Okay, that's from Hoan Nguyen. Thank you very much for that great question there. Glad you thought it was interesting. How do we take into account interactions and trade-offs? So one of the ways that we do that is when we are working with the community groups around the table, we're very open about the trade-offs. We have community tables scoring the different interactions, debating and changing those scores, because essentially different groups have different views about what the trade-offs are. So we can do this in various ways. The first thing is to be open about trade-offs, to have good discussions with communities about what, for example, are the key benefits in the system. What happens when you trade off, for example, arable land with increasing areas of salt marshery managed realignment? You might get, for example, increases in ecosystem service benefits, but you might also have financial implications for food production. So I think trade-offs is a really difficult area, because it's easy to talk about trade-offs in an academic sense. But when you're working with a community on the ground with real stakeholders who have real economic interests, trade-offs are a real thing. So we have to build that into the system by actually the way we design the workshops, the way we design the scenarios, how we score and rank different issues, but ultimately it is up to the communities to make the decisions about how they deal with trade-offs in their local environments.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Graham Russell. How are stakeholder representatives chosen? Some stakeholder groups, such as fishing, are heterogeneous. Sometimes reps can form senior levels, although the knowledge is held by others.
Yeah, this is a really important issue. I think it's a process of constant improvement for us around this. The key for us that we found what worked was building and cultivating a very close relationship with the coastal partnerships. The coastal partnerships really knew their local area far better than what we have. I've never been to the Deben estuary. Now I've been there 3 times now and know a lot more about it. But including the previous 4 pilots that we ran as well in Scotland, developing this relationship with the coastal partnerships, and then via their local knowledge and their local expertise, working with them to choose a range of different partnerships across different sectors. Now this is still a limited set. We are limited by time, and we're limited by resource, and we're limited by capacity in the workshops. So in the workshops, we'd have about 20 to 30 people across these different stakeholder groups. So we ensured that we worked with the coastal partnerships to identify. They knew who were the key stakeholders in the room to bring. We worked very much with stakeholders who were local representatives of those different industries. We worked with, even if it was government agencies, they were ones that were regional officer based or locality based. So there's no perfect way to do this. but we certainly advocate to have a much more rigorous stakeholder application in the future, where we do run more workshops essentially, or run bigger workshops around this. But it is a process of constant listening and constant improvement to work with stakeholders, because the results of this are stakeholder driven. So the selection at the front is critical.
Okay, thank you. So we have reached the 2 o'clock kind of cool time, but I expect we have time for just a couple more questions. Is that okay, Tavis?
Yeah. There's someone I want to answer here, actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Tim Stjanovic, just a comment I think there from Tim there that we've been liking is there's been a lot of emphasis in that. It's how we operationalize this, I think. I'm always really impressed. This comes to some earlier questions as well about the tacit and local knowledge that communities have about their marine environment. And this method, this approach really tries to draw that out. They're the experts, and they're the ones who use and consume and have their local services and have a stake in this process. So I think it's really important that we have to push and find ways, such as this approach, to do this operationally, to be able to build this into marine spatial planning, to take some of the marine spatial plans that are very large scale, for example, and then focus them elements of those plans down at the local scale. How do large-scale marine plans actually operationalize in communities along the coast, for example? So this is the challenge about how we operationalize this. Do I think it's worth moving towards a simpler approach and to encourage stakeholder engagement? No, actually, Ellie, I think while what we've presented here is fairly complicated, we've designed the workshops in a way that is very engaging to the stakeholders present. So for example, we're having talks about the science of the localities. We're having talks, it's a very hands-on process in actually getting people to draw on maps and engage with the different aspects of their environment. We are constantly feeding back to them. We are feeding back to them in between the workshops and providing fairly simple but robust tools like the clickable PDFs, for example. So I think the actual process of going through the workshops is relatively simple, but then we can take that data and then present it in ways that's more complex, that can support policy decisions. For example, how a particular development or a change or scenario will actually change the distribution of services. So there's a few more there. Do you want to keep going down?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to highlight that this session is being recorded. So if anyone who has attended hasn't heard and submitted a question and hasn't heard their answer yet, but needs to scoot off, it will be up on our YouTube video when I upload it later today. So don't worry, we will answer through these questions in our recording.
And I'm happy to take some of these questions on board if they can be sent to me, provide a written response as well if people are keen to do that.
Great, yeah. So I think the next question is David Patterson's.
So yeah, this one, I think this is a really controversial issue in how we approach biodiversity in these types of assessments. Biodiversity is both a part of the natural capital and it can be a benefit as well. So it's really where you place biodiversity in the system. This was a benefit that was mentioned from the stakeholders themselves, rather than something that we brought through from our previous assessments. So yeah, I would say it is too intrinsic to value as a separate service. It's actually part of the structure of natural capital which delivers services, although there are some questions obviously about biodiversity and the extent of the benefits that's provided from it. So I think it is definitely too intrinsic to value as a separate service. Tim again. Yep. Yeah, I think that's where we felt the gap was, Tim. We support this work actually can work very well with the National Asset Register approach. They're not mutually exclusive. National Asset Registers will be important for large-scale marine planning, strategic large-scale plans, but then how does that work locally? And a lot of the work we've done in these local communities, we've actually found there is a real lack of decent, meaningful, granular spatial data at the local level. For example, the large-scale data sets didn't represent recreation very well at a small scale at a local level. There were aspects of recreation that were totally missed from some of the large-scale databases. So I think it's really important to have both the asset register approach combined with the local understanding, interpretation, and most importantly, use, because it's at the local levels that services are used, not at the abstract national level. These affect people's lives and well-being at the local scale. So it's important to get that right and to have that discussion about it. Thanks for participatory methods of dealt. Absolutely, yeah. I think that's where we want to take it, Michael. Thank you for the question. I think there could be some really interesting, for example, modelling approaches here. So we've based our scenarios, for example, on the results of how different benefits are scored in the matrix. But I think there's some really interesting approaches there we could take where we could model some of the outputs. So how do particular natural capital systems and benefits and beneficiaries change over time? I think there's a really interesting scope for collaboration, actually modeling and forecasting how these things change. So yeah, definitely an area where we want to get into is linking these two ecosystem models for sure. Tim again. Yes. Yeah, well, I guess my previous answer relates to that as well, the subjective assessments of the benefits. So one way we could deal with that is by running more workshops. We are limited by time and resources, or building in some more, for example, broader social engagement around this. So as previous comments have noticed, selection of stakeholders is critical. How can we actually get some of the valuation of the links between benefits and beneficiaries, for example, to be done more broadly? It could be, for example, a survey that's done locally, or something that is able to collect more data locally with a much broader net of stakeholders. So that'd be one way that we could potentially deal with that, but limited time and resources naturally. So. Nguyen as well. I think I've answered that before. How do we take into account implicit interactions and trade-offs? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've answered that one already. But yeah, it's a challenging area. We need to make sure that we're open about the relationships between benefits, natural capital and benefits and beneficiaries. We need to be open in our dialogue with stakeholders about trade-offs. Trade-offs according to who, for example. And we're very wary of saying these are the key benefits for a region, they're the priority, because the benefits are used so broadly amongst different groups. So I think it's just being really open about it and having that dialogue with communities about it. Catherine, yeah, absolutely. If anyone wants the papers, copies of the papers or the references, just email me or contact MASTS. I'm happy to forward them directly to you.
They've also just been tweeted online by your colleague Daryl Burdon. Yeah. So they're up online, those links.
Yeah. Charlotte, yeah, we've kind of addressed that question as well, but it's just I can't emphasize enough that it's a critical part of the process. We found working with the coastal partnerships to be definitely the way in to there, and we had really robust discussions. We also, in each workshop, also the 4 pilots plus the Deben workshop as well, we collected at the end of every workshop feedback from stakeholders. So we actually have data from the 5 workshops about the process, how we could improve it. The actual process, I didn't cover this in the talk, but the actual methodology that we designed has been genuinely co-produced and I know this word gets thrown about a whole lot of co-production, the stakeholders and the comments that they've made through the history of this work has changed the methodology. For example, we switched from using polygon-based, GIS-based maps to satellite images because stakeholders wanted a much more closer, granular examination of their coast. We changed the structure of the workshops because of feedback from the stakeholders themselves. We looked at providing the graphical interface rather than the matrix, for example, because that just wasn't working very well in groups. So the whole methodology has been co-designed, and as a result of working with different groups of stakeholders around the UK. That can constantly change, and we feel like we do have a genuinely participatory approach to these. But again, it's a process of continual improvement and getting new stakeholders in, running more workshops, engaging with different groups of people. I'm particularly interested in how we engage the unheard voices, the voices that don't traditionally come to the table. Socially marginalized groups, for example, how do we get them engaged in these types of processes? I think that's a really interesting research challenge.
Right, we have just a couple more questions left.
I'll have to finish soon. I'm losing my voice.
The next one was from Leslie Mabin, one of our previous presenters. One of the difficulties and criticisms of ecosystem services approaches is that they can mask contention within a community or reinforce existing power inequalities. How can you account for differing power relations and or show dissensus and contention in your research and outputs?
Wow, that's a new word. I haven't heard of dissensus before, so every day is a school day. Yeah, I think the first thing is that really is a part of the reasoning why we felt we had to bring in the beneficiaries side of this. We think there is a major gap in our understanding, and both in the broader practice of natural capital, around how these benefits are distributed amongst communities and amongst stakeholders, and of course the power inequalities will reflect that. If you have a major change to a coastal system, for example, you plonk a golf course on a dune system, the benefits are going to change from one social group to another, whether it's in terms of access, whether it's in terms of different cultures, whether it's in terms of different groups using that. So building in the work, the part 3, the third workshop around beneficiaries and how they are reliant they are on the systems, and how important natural capital is for different groups, really starts to open the lid on that box of understanding actually the very complex social relationships that people have with their coasts. And then by revealing that complexity can be quite controversial, because it does then shine a light on, if you change that use, there will potentially be conflict around that. And that's just the real world of having to deal with that. But we tend to, with some of the asset register approaches, for example, the large scale approaches, kind of put that to the side. And I think for me, and for Darryl, and for the work that we've done, that's really interesting aspect of natural capital is actually, well, how does this apply to communities? How does this change? Who's accessing the benefits? Who's getting the well-being? Who isn't? And how can we actually be much more democratic in how benefits are distributed, or ethical, or have whatever word you want to use, and how benefits are used and distributed amongst communities on the coast, how everyone can benefit from healthy coasts and healthy marine systems. But yeah, it's a really good question, and a very interesting area of research.
Great. From Paula Duffy, can you say a few words of how you see this work expanding to work with community well-being to understand the distribution of these benefits and social economic inequalities in these distributions, or indeed how changes in these natural systems may impact the inequalities in experience of well-being amongst coastal communities?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've kind of covered some of that in the previous question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's more where we want to go with it. I mean, we're limited in these workshops in terms of what we can do, and we're not going to change coastal power inequalities of different stakeholders in 3 workshops, and the data that we get from it. What we would hope is that the data that is produced from these workshops about the complex relationships and deep relationships that people have with the sea is then actually taken forward, and those communities are actually empowered. Then we are developing this information, we give that to the communities for them to use themselves. So for example, in the Deben, a lot of the information we've developed around benefits and beneficiaries will be then used in their own planning processes. They might use this, for example, to identify areas of investment, of developing nature-based solutions, of actually choosing or preferencing certain types of development in certain areas, because they know that actually is a very good way of opening up benefits of nature to the community. That they can have more robust debates with local planning processes, with agencies about how they use their local environment. So I think it's a very early days for that type of approach, but by developing this information for the first time, by making it visible, we can then take that forward for communities actually to empower themselves and help them engage with planning processes that maximize natural capital for them. So it's early days yet, but yeah, I certainly take the point.
Thank you. And now for our last question, how do you deal with the processes that are probabilistic? Yachtsmen know the mouth of the Deben moves over time in ways that are not predictable. Similarly, the outcome of some changes cannot be reliably predicted.
Yeah, absolutely. This is part of the challenge, I think, and the opportunity of working with local knowledge, particularly in a system that we're not familiar with as well. So the scenario, we have to really work hard at scenario design, and we learned a lot about scenario design by working with these groups and using local knowledge there. Ultimately, this is a snapshot. This is a static snapshot of a highly dynamic system that changes. I think there are some opportunities to work with modelers in the future and look at more probabilistic ways of understanding these systems and understanding the relationships between natural capital and the benefits and the beneficiaries. I think we can do a lot in that space, and we anticipate doing a lot more in that space. We also need to combine those modeling approaches with the local knowledge and the local opinions about how things change in these systems over time when we're doing forecasting, looking at more probabilistic ways or Monte Carlo simulations or things like that. So yeah, these are static snapshots. Both the matrix approach and this and the participatory approach are static snapshots of highly dynamic systems, and I think there's a lot more work to do in making them more dynamic and looking at some of the inherent unpredictability in them. But yeah, it's a way that it is certainly an area that needs to be improved in the approach, but it also gives us a baseline to work from as well. They're all very, very good questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tavis, for sticking through that and answering all the questions that were submitted, and to all the attendees who are still joining us right now. Yeah, that was a great talk and a great series of questions as well. As I said, this was all recorded, so we'll be up on YouTube at the end of today. And I would just like to highlight our upcoming talks as well that we have. So if any of those talks interest you, please register to attend using the same link that you've used before. And yeah, we look forward to anyone else joining our future webinars. The 3rd and 10th of June are currently available. So if you would like to give a webinar, please let me know. You can contact us on the email address that is shown there. So thank you very much, Tavis, and for everyone who attended.
Thank you, everybody. Much appreciated.